Hi guys, welcome back to Set Speaks. In today's video, I will be discussing the con and heist structure, morally ambiguous criminals, and the found family trope in Six of Crows and Leverage. I'll start by discussing the structure of the heists and cons that each team pulls off. A heist storyline is usually divided into the following parts: the job offer, assembling the team, making the plan, things go mostly according to plan, there's an obstacle and one or two plot twists, and finally, the end. In Six of Crows, Kaz Brekker was hired by a wealthy merchant named Jan van Eck to steal a scientist named Bo Yulbayer from the ice court. Yulbayer had created a drug known as Perem, a stimulant that, when consumed by a Grisha, alters their perception and greatly enhances their abilities. The Merchant Council of Kerch wants to help prevent the drug from spreading, and Kaz ultimately agrees to the job as long as he and his crew get paid 30 million Kruga. The job itself appears impossible at first because no one had ever broken into the ice court before. So Kaz enlists the help of his fellow crows: Inej the spy, Jesper the sharpshooter, Nina the Heartrender and languages expert, and Wylan their demolitions expert. He also breaks out Matthias Helvar out of Hellgate and bribes him with his pardon. Matthias is a former Grisha hunter who knows the layout of the ice court. And Kaz is the mastermind who comes up with a plan, but he never fully reveals his plans to the crew. They end up successful for the most part, except for the fact that Yulbayer had already died, and so they got his son Kuwait instead, who also knew how to manufacture the drug. The plot twist is that Van Eck lied to them and also double-crossed them. The council knew nothing about the deal between Van Eck and Kaz, and Van Eck's plan all along was that once he got the formula for Perem, he would buy up the Jurda fields in Novia Zem, allowing him to have sole control of the Jurda supply when the governments demand them, making him very wealthy. He then tries to have the crows killed, but fails, and he kidnaps Inej. The sequel, Crooked Kingdom, centers on Kaz's revenge plan against Van Eck. "No," said Kaz. "We're going to make like merchants and let the market do the work for us." He leaned back, gloved hands resting on his crow's head cane. "We're going to take Van Eck's money, and then we're going to take his reputation. We're going to make sure he can never do business in Ketterdam or anywhere in Kerch ever again." In the auction scene near the end, Van Eck is trying to get Kaz arrested for various crimes: swindling the council out of their money, kidnapping his wife Alice and his son Wylan. But Kaz proves to be the mastermind because he somehow has an alibi or evidence to refute Van Eck's accusations. The council put funds in at Van Eck's encouragement. Alice can't confirm if the crows kidnapped her because she was blindfolded, and the note that Kaz left about her kidnapping was not signed with his name, so there's no concrete evidence that he did kidnap her. And Wylan played his part perfectly and revealed to the council that his father had him roughed up. And this was one of those scenes that you had to take your time in reading because you can't help but marvel at the sheer brilliance that Kaz is able to account for all of these things. And he made this plan to ruin Van Eck, and Van Eck basically just keeps digging himself into a bigger hole every time he opened his mouth. So by the end of the auction scene, Van Eck was starting to lose his power and credibility. But that wasn't enough for the crows, especially Kaz. Van Eck tells Kaz that Wylan won't see his inheritance, and Kaz pretends to be confused and goes, "Wylan told me that you guys reconciled before all of this nasty business." And because this part was being told from Wylan's perspective, he realized that Kaz had replaced his father's will with a forgery the night they broke into Van Eck's office. Because Van Eck is a terrible dad, he reveals Wylan's dyslexia to the council and calls him names. Now, despite Wylan being dyslexic, he actually has an insanely good memory when it comes to remembering what people are reading to him. So he asked the council for the transfer of authority and pretended to read it before them. Wylan had only heard Jesper read the transfer of authority to him once before, and he remembered it word for word. So Van Ack looked like a fool because he's claiming Weiland can't read, but Weiland fooled the council into thinking that he can read. So Van Ack's credibility was gone, and so was his money. Leverage also follows a similar plot structure per episode, except theirs is more of a con than a heist. They meet the client, they research the company/corporation they're targeting. The con goes mostly as planned. The con reaches a complication or the bad guy gets the upper hand. And finally, the reveal at the end that showed how they worked around the complication and the bad guy is defeated. The pilot episode did things a little bit differently. Nate Ford was approached by Victor Dubenich, who claimed that his rival Pearson stole his designs and he wants Nate to steal the plans back. But even though Ford was put into the mastermind role, Dubenich had already hired the rest of the crew. Parker the thief, Hardison the hacker, and Elliot the retrieval specialist/hitter. The job seems to go well enough, despite the three criminals being known for being unable to work in a team. And they steal the planes after breaking into Pearson headquarters and send the planes to Dubenich before going their separate ways while waiting for the payout. But Dubenich claims that he never got the copies and refuses to pay them. Dubenich tells Nate to meet him at an abandoned warehouse where the others also showed up. They ultimately realize that Dubenich lured them there and tried to kill them by having the warehouse blown up. After barely escaping, they see the news where Pearson Aviation claims that their plans were stolen, and they realize that Dubenich lied to all of them. Nate decides to run a con on Dubenich and enlists the help of a final person, Sophie Devereaux, the grifter. The rest of the episode, we get to see them pull the Nigerian job on Dubenich. Sophie pretends to be working for an African trade company and goes to Dubenich for a contract, since he's planning on presenting the stolen airplane plans from Pearson as his own companies. They even set up an office to make it all believable, and there were also Nigerians involved. But Dubenich became suspicious when he finds the transmitter that the crew planted under his desk, and he also realized that Sophie was working with Nate. So at the shareholders meeting, he leads Sophie and the Nigerians to a conference room and calls the FBI to arrest them. But the FBI arrests Dubenich for soliciting a bribe from the Nigerian officials.
Dubenich, you're under arrest for soliciting a bribe from these Nigerian government officials.
I'm not under. These are not even Nigerians.
Of course we are.
It turns out Sophie had claimed to the Nigerians that she worked directly under Dubenich. The Nigerians had given Dubenich an envelope with a check, but when Sophie had shown him the envelope, it hadn't been a check, so she made a switch that was not seen. Dubenich's company headquarters was raided by the FBI, and his company's stock dropped 33% the next day. Nate calls him and reveals the plan.
See, if a company's stock price falls 10, 15% in one day, you see it coming, you sell short, you make a lot of money. If it's going to fall 30%, you can make shattering amounts of money. Now, we didn't need the FBI to take you to jail. We just need them to show up and take boxes out of your office all day long, in front of TV cameras, scaring your investors.
So even though the Leverage crew performed a con and the Crows performed a heist, there were quite a few similarities in the plot structure and the stories. Both crews were hired and ultimately double-crossed by a businessman who played dirty so he can expand his wealth. And each crew's payback involved ruining the bad guy's reputation and taking his money. Now I'm going to talk about the Crows and the Leverage crew. They're not heroes, not even Nate Ford, who had been the sole honest man on his crew. They're all criminals, so why do we root for them? It's simple. They're not jerks. Like, yes, they are criminals, but they all have some moral code. Kaz, who is the worst criminal in the Crows, doesn't do things without a reason, and he only ever hurts people who hurt others. His main reason for wanting revenge on Pekka Rollins was because Rollins conned him and his brother out of their money when they were younger, and that led to them being homeless and vulnerable when the plague hit Ketterdam. Kaz and his brother Jordy both got the sickness, but Kaz was the only one who survived, and he woke up surrounded by corpses in the water, including his own brothers. The Leverage crew, too, are more like a Robin Hood-esque group of criminals. They steal and con the rich and powerful who had hurt regular people. They don't target regular people. If they did, then we wouldn't like them as much and they would be major jerks. There are so many similarities between these two crews, and what's so funny is that none of the stuff they pulled would have happened if Dubenich and Van Eck had just paid them.
Where's my money?
The only reason they took the jobs was because of the money and not because they were doing it out of the goodness of their hearts. Kaz wants the money so that he can get his revenge on Pekka Rollins, and this is his interaction with Van Eck when Van Eck is trying to hire him for the job. Our hopes rest with you, Mr. Brekker. If you fail, all the world will suffer for it. Oh, it's worse than that, Van Eck. If I fail, I don't get paid. The same goes for the Leverage crew, particularly Parker.
My money's not in my account. That makes me cry inside. In my special angry place.
But even Nate pointed out to Dubenich that none of this would have happened if he had just paid them.
Yeah, you should have just paid us.
So overall, the Crows and the Leverage crew are criminals, but we root for them because they have a moral code and they only ever hurt people who have hurt or exploited others. So, and also like watching them target like the rich and powerful is just very cathartic in this day and age. But apart from the catharsis that the audience feels with these teams taking down the rich and powerful, they're both so lovable because of their found family dynamic. None of the Crows have any family. Kaz lost his parents and his brother at a young age. Inej was stolen from hers. Matthias's family died when he was younger. Nina grew up in the Little Palace, and Wyland's dad tried to have him killed because of his disability. Jesper's the only one with a living parent who cares, even if Jesper did lie to his dad about his gambling and being at university. So these characters all came together, and even though they argue and bicker, it's so evident that they care for each other. They were both bleeding, Jesper from a cut on his lip and Kaz from somewhere near his brow. Jesper's shirt was halfway over his head and Kaz's sleeve was tearing at the seam. The trapdoor sprang open and Colm Fahey's head emerged. His ruddy cheeks went even redder. "Jesper Llewellyn Fahey, that is enough," he roared. Jesper and Kaz both startled, and then to Wyland's shock, they stepped away from each other, looking guilty. "Just what is going on here?" Colm said. "I thought you were friends." Jesper ran a hand over the back of his neck, looking like he wanted to vanish through the floorboards. We were having a disagreement." "I can see that. I have been very patient with all of this, Jesper, but I am at my limit. I want you down here before I count to 10, or I will tan your hide so you don't sit for 2 weeks. Colm's head vanished back down the stairs. The silence stretched. Then Nina giggled. "You are in so much trouble." Jesper scowled. "Matthias?" Nina let Cornelis Smeet grip her bottom. Nina stopped laughing. "I'm going to turn your teeth inside out." "That is physically impossible. I just raised the dead. Do you really want to argue with me?" Inej caught her head to one side. "Jesper Llewellyn Fahey?" "Shut up," said Jesper. "It's a family name." Inej made a solemn bow. "Whatever you say, Llewellyn." "Kaz," Jesper said tentatively, but Kaz was staring into the middle distance. Wyland thought he knew that look. "Is that?" asked Wyland. "Scheming face," said Jesper. Matthias nodded. "Definitely." And here's another one. "It's not a gift, it's a curse." But when it came down to it, Jesper's life had been full of blessings. His father, his mother, Inej, Nina, Matthias leading them across the muddy canal. Kaz, even Kaz with all his cruelties and failings, had given him a home and a family in the dregs when Ketterdam might have swallowed him whole. And Wyland who had understood before Jesper ever had that the power inside him might be a blessing too. They all bicker and maybe even fight, but at the end of the day, they love each other and they have each other's backs. The same goes for the Leverage crew. They're more than just a team of criminals who team up to help regular people. They're a family. And while there are many instances throughout the show that show that they are a family, here's my favorite one.
We got you presents.
Yeah. You're first.
Hardison. Don't torture her.
Oh, okay. All right, Parker, you're next. Put your hands out.
How did you know? Non-sequential serial numbers? My favorite.
Them hanging out at a bar, spending this holiday together, and even getting each other gifts, that's something that a family does. And so these characters may be morally ambiguous criminals, but seeing them act like a family with one another shows a more compassionate side to them. And that's why I love the Crows and the Leverage crew so much. Found family. It gets me every time. And that's a wrap on 6 of Crows and Leverage, Found Family featuring crime. Tune in next week for my video on Avengers Endgame. Thank you guys so much for watching my video, and please don't forget to like, comment, or subscribe.